What if true horror doesn't hide in the shadows, but in the quiet corners of the human mind? What if the monster we fear is not a creature from another world, but a reflection of everything we try to forget? Pennywise, the clown from it, is not merely a supernatural predator. He is something far more disturbing, the physical form of fear itself. He doesn't hunt like a beast. He waits, feeds, and grows stronger from the very thing that weakens us the most: unresolved pain. Why do children fear the dark? Why do we dream of being chased? Why does our past, no matter how deeply buried, find a way to echo in our adult lives? In this psychological exploration, we'll dive into the true nature of Pennywise, not as a creature of fiction, but as a symbol of trauma, repression, and the dark cycles passed through generations. What if Pennywise isn't just a monster, but a mirror? Long before he was known as Pennywise, the dancing clown, before balloons, sewers, and red paint, there existed a presence. A cosmic, shape-shifting force that came from the macroverse, an ancient, unknowable dimension outside the boundaries of time and reality. It is not bound by human rules. It does not age, does not breathe, does not feel in the way we understand. Its essence is fear. Its instinct is to survive, and to do that, it adapted. It became what we most dread. It became what we could not look away from. The clown wasn't a coincidence. Clowns are meant to bring laughter, but there's something deeply unsettling about the exaggerated smile, the frozen expression, the hidden identity. Psychologists refer to this as cognitive dissonance, the discomfort of encountering something that doesn't match expectations. What should be joyful becomes eerie, and that unease is the perfect seed for fear. But Pennywise doesn't just haunt, he infects. The town of Derry, Maine is his playground and, more importantly, his feeding ground. Every 27 years, the cycle begins again. Children go missing, strange accidents happen, and the adults say nothing. The silence is deafening. The town seems cursed, but what if it isn't? What if Derry isn't cursed? It's conditioned. The people of Derry have learned to forget, to repress, to look the other way. And this repression is what allows Pennywise to thrive. In many ways, he represents collective trauma, a shared darkness buried so deep that no one dares to acknowledge it. The first psychological trait emerges here: the fear of the unknown, also called xenophobia of the mind. Humans fear what cannot be named or understood. Pennywise uses that to his advantage, appearing in forms so surreal, so specific to each victim, that the fear becomes personal, intimate. He doesn't just appear in shadows. He appears in memories and guilt, and what was left unsaid. And Derry is not just a town. It's a metaphor, a symbolic place where unspeakable things happen under the surface of normality. A town that smiles on the outside, but is rotting beneath. Like the mind of someone who never confronted their trauma. But there was something no one saw coming, a shift, a challenge. A group of children who decided not to forget. What makes a mind break? What moment defines when fear stops being just an emotion and becomes a parasite? In it, Pennywise doesn't simply appear to terrify. He awakens what was already broken. He thrives in the fragile spaces within the human psyche, especially the minds of children, where reality is still fluid and pain hasn't yet found words. Each of the Losers Club members carries a silent wound. They are not just victims of a monster in the sewer. They are victims of something much more real: emotional abandonment, parental control, societal neglect, and psychological abuse. Bill suffers from deep grief and guilt over the disappearance of his little brother Georgie. But it's not just the loss, it's the silence that follows. The way his parents emotionally shut down, leaving Bill alone in his mourning. Beverly grows up under the shadow of a controlling, possibly abusive father. Her fear isn't Pennywise at first. It's the sound of footsteps outside her bedroom. Eddie is raised to believe he's weak, fragile, and sick. His mother conditions him to see the world as a threat. Mike, Ben, Richie, and Stan each carry their own scars, from racism to bullying, from religious pressure to isolation. Pennywise doesn't invent their fears. He mirrors them. He becomes them. This is where his power comes from. He scans the emotional structure of his victim and takes the form that will cut deepest. For Beverly, it's blood pouring from the bathroom, sink menstruation, trauma, the loss of innocence. For Eddie, it's a diseased leper. For Bill, it's Georgie's ghost. These are not random scares. These are psychological manifestations of trauma. Psychologists call this symbolic fear, where the mind creates imagery to represent suppressed emotional pain. These symbols often appear in dreams, flashbacks, or anxiety attacks. Pennywise essentially weaponizes this psychological process. But there's a deeper mechanism at work: repression. According to Freud and later trauma theorists, what the mind cannot process, it buries. But what is buried does not disappear. It mutates. It haunts. The children of Derry grow up in a town that constantly tells them to forget, to move on, to not talk about it. And in doing so, it creates the perfect host for Pennywise to survive. When the Losers Club begins to remember, when they start to speak, to connect, to face the truth, Pennywise grows weaker. But as children, they are still trapped. They haven't yet developed the emotional tools to fully understand what they're experiencing, and this is where the rupture happens. Each encounter with Pennywise pushes them closer to a breaking point, not just physically, but mentally. They begin to question what's real, what's imagined, and whether their fears are even theirs to begin with. The boundary between memory and hallucination starts to blur. The internal conflict collides with the external one. And this is where psychology and horror merge. The terror outside is inseparable from the terror within. Pennywise isn't hunting them. He's challenging them. He forces them to face their most painful truths. And for a child, the confrontation is a form of psychological collapse, but also possibly a form of awakening. And it was there, in the sewers of Derry and in the shadows of their minds, that something irreversible began. Everything started to unravel. As the cycles repeat every 27 years, Pennywise evolves beyond a mere predator. He becomes a complex pattern of fear, control, and manipulation. The entity's presence is no longer just an external threat, but an internalized structure within the minds and culture of Derry itself. In psychological terms, Pennywise mirrors the concept of traumatic memory consolidation, where experiences of trauma are encoded deeply, creating neural pathways that become harder to erase over time. These traumatic memories shape behavior, perception, and even identity. Pennywise embodies this, a living metaphor for how unhealed trauma festers beneath the surface, growing stronger with every denial and silence. The way Pennywise appears, shifting forms, playful tricks, and terrifying games reflects dissociative phenomena observed in trauma survivors. Dissociation is the mind's way of protecting itself by disconnecting from reality or fragmenting identity during overwhelming stress. Similarly, Pennywise confuses his victims, making them doubt what is real and what is imagined. His terrifying laugh and unpredictable behavior mimic the chaos of a mind wrestling with fractured memories. Moreover, Pennywise's cyclical return mirrors the re-experiencing symptoms of PTSD, where trauma resurfaces repeatedly, triggered by seemingly unrelated events. Each awakening is like a flashback, forcing the town and its inhabitants to relive their worst fears and failures. The town of Derry, much like a mind trapped in trauma, exhibits collective denial and repression. The adults' refusal to acknowledge the disappearances and violence is a psychological defense mechanism on a social scale, akin to mass repression or collective dissociation. By ignoring the trauma, the community allows Pennywise to continue feeding and growing stronger. On a symbolic level, Pennywise's layered manifestations, appearing as different fears to each child, illustrate how trauma is highly individualized. What terrifies one person may be invisible to another. This aligns with psychological research on subjective trauma. Each brain constructs its own narrative and symbols to represent pain and fear. Through these lenses, Pennywise is not just a monster, but a deeply structured system of fear, one that feeds on silence, confusion, and repression. His evolution is a reflection of the growing darkness in Derry's collective psyche, a darkness nurtured by denial and fear. But beneath this growing chaos, the true threat remains dormant, a monstrous force tied not just to fear itself, but to what fear can become when it is left unchecked. And so, while Pennywise torments the children and shadows the town, the real monster still sleeps. There comes a moment when fear stops being just a reaction and becomes a way of life. For Pennywise, that moment is when the cycle of terror becomes normalized, accepted as part of everyday existence. In the town of Derry, this is the point of no return. Psychologically, this mirrors the phenomenon of trauma normalization, when individuals or communities become so accustomed to violence, neglect, or emotional pain that these states cease to shock or provoke action. Instead, silence and indifference take hold, creating a fertile ground for continued suffering. In Derry, disappearances are routine. Tragedies are ignored. Parents turn blind eyes. Neighbors whisper, but do not intervene. This collective amnesia is not accidental. It is a defense mechanism, a shared denial designed to protect the community from confronting the overwhelming horror beneath the surface. This societal repression is the catalyst that allows Pennywise to operate openly. No longer confined to the shadows, the entity thrives in the gaps left by apathy and denial. Fear becomes embedded in the fabric of everyday life, silent, pervasive, and insidious. At this juncture, the line between victim and enabler blurs. Is Pennywise simply a monster? Or is he a reflection of the darkness within the human heart? A darkness born from neglect, fear of confrontation, and the refusal to face painful truths. Here lies a profound moral dilemma. What if Pennywise's power comes not only from external fear, but from the internal complicity of those who choose to ignore it? What if the real terror is not in what Pennywise does, but in what people allow to continue by looking away? This raises unsettling questions about morality and responsibility. When does self-preservation become complicity? When does silence become consent? And if Pennywise represents that unspoken evil, that hidden fear, then what happens when the community itself stops fighting back? What happens when the cycle is accepted rather than challenged? This is the point of no return, the moment when fear becomes a permanent state, when hope dims, and when the possibility of change seems distant. But what if? What if Pennywise is not simply evil incarnate? What if he is also a warning? A mirror held up to society's darkest corners, asking, what if he is right? To truly understand Pennywise, we must look beyond superstition and fear into the cold, hard science of how fear works in the human brain. Because Pennywise's power isn't magic, it's biology. Neuroscience teaches us that fear activates the amygdala, the brain's ancient alarm system. This region processes threats and triggers rapid responses designed to protect us from danger, freeze, flight, or fight. When the amygdala is hijacked, rational thought shuts down and instinct takes control. Pennywise exploits this biological wiring perfectly. He doesn't need to be physically powerful. He only needs to trigger that primal response. Once fear overwhelms reason, his victims become vulnerable, paralyzed, and easier to manipulate. Psychologists also identify how chronic fear rewires the brain, creating hypervigilance, a constant state of alert that can lead to anxiety disorders and PTSD. This means that victims live trapped in their trauma, reliving it repeatedly, unable to escape. Pennywise's cyclical appearances reflect this. Like a trauma flashback, his return isn't random, but follows a pattern similar to how trauma resurfaces over time, sometimes dormant, sometimes overwhelming. His manipulations mimic tactics seen in real-world psychological abuse, gaslighting, isolation, and intimidation. These tactics break down an individual's sense of reality and self-worth, increasing dependence on the abuser. Pennywise is the ultimate abuser, calculating, patient, and relentless. Historical cases of manipulation and control in families or cults show striking parallels. Fear is used as a tool to maintain power. Victims often struggle to break free, their minds entangled in webs of confusion and terror. Pennywise embodies this dark dynamic in its purest form. But here's the chilling truth. Pennywise's actions aren't madness. They are cold calculation. Every scare, every shift in form, every whispered threat is designed to maximize fear and control. This is not chaos, it is an eerie, strategic order. The science of horror reveals that Pennywise's terror is rooted in the most basic human survival mechanisms, twisted into a weapon. Understanding this logic makes the horror all the more real and all the more terrifying. When the Losers Club finally confronts Pennywise, what they truly face is not a creature, but an idea, a manifestation of the fears and traumas internalized by generations. Defeating Pennywise is less about physical victory and more about confronting their own shadows, embracing painful truths, and breaking free from the cycles that once controlled them. Yet, the battle's end does not mean the end of the legacy. Pennywise does not simply vanish. He retreats, slumbering beneath the surface, like the dormant wounds carried by survivors of trauma. The scars remain invisible but palpable, influencing behavior, relationships, and even the culture of Derry itself. The town bears the weight of its history, its secrets, silences, and unspoken horrors. Memory fades, stories are forgotten or dismissed, and new generations grow unaware of the darkness lurking just beneath their feet. This cycle of forgetting is a common survival mechanism for trauma survivors, a way to protect the mind from overwhelming pain. But the legacy lives on. Psychologically, trauma is often intergenerational. Emotional patterns, fears, and behaviors are passed down, sometimes without conscious awareness. The shadow of Pennywise, then, is not confined to Derry or a specific time. It is a symbol of the ongoing struggle with fear, denial, and repression that affects communities everywhere. This raises a profound question. Who are we to judge the monster when we may unknowingly nurture it ourselves? How often do we, as individuals and societies, ignore our own shadows, choosing comfort and silence over the painful work of healing? Pennywise is a mirror held up to humanity's darkest corners. He forces us to ask difficult questions about fear, trauma, and responsibility. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is that this monster may not be the last. The cycle may pause, but the seeds it plants continue to grow, waiting for the next moment of weakness to emerge.